Welcome to The Untold Story, everybody. I'm Martha McCallum, and today we are very lucky because I'm joined by Admiral James Stavridis. He wrote a new book called The Restless Wave, and he is, of course, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces and rose through the ranks of the Navy to become a four-star admiral. Previously commanded U.S. Southern Command, and you know him from his books, his novels, nonfiction, and his work at Tufts University and as a naval scholar and a historian of great note. So it's great to have you with us today. Thank you very much, Admiral.
Thanks, Martha. Wonderful to be with you.
So you join us. We want to talk about your book a bit, too, but I really want to get your thoughts on what's happening today, because what we learned just about an hour or so ago, and this is Thursday at about 2:30 in the afternoon that we're having this discussion, that Yahya Sinwar, the military leader and then the political leader as well of Hamas, was taken out by Israeli forces. And we're still learning some of the details around this, but this is obviously the crescendo of a number of killings that have removed Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, Ismail Haniyeh, the former political wing head of Hamas, and now to take out this ruthless leader of the terrorist branch of Hamas, I should say, is a huge victory for Israel. What's your reaction?
Oh, it's a wonderful day. And I compare it to Osama bin Laden. It feels that way to the Israelis. This guy, Yahya Sinwar, is a deeply evil human being who created this idea of using rape and torture and mutilation to attack the state of Israel. Truly someone to take off the chessboard. I think it'll make a big difference going forward. I celebrate the victory of Israel today.
So, this podcast is The Untold Story, so I want to peel back the layers a little bit on this individual. Sinwar was held in Israel as a prisoner for quite some time. He was one of the people we always hear about, these prisoner swaps, and in this one, I think there were something like 1,000 prisoners who were traded from Israel back into to Gaza. He has basically spent his whole life towards one goal.
His goal, through and through, has been to kill Jews. And he is the ultimate practitioner of that. He cloaks it in a mythology of religion. He is a cold-blooded, cold-hearted killer. He is gone, and the world is a better place. I think there are 2 points to be made here. Tactically, this is a hammer blow to the heart of Hamas. Yes, there'll be others who try to step up to take the mantle, but this was the carrier of the culture of evil of Hamas. He's dead. That's a good thing. And I think strategically, if we're allowed to have a ray of hope about the Middle East, it could be, Martha, that this would open the conversation to create a ceasefire, get the remnants of Hamas out of Gaza, bring in an Arab peacekeeping force, and hopefully dial down this situation. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but not only is it tactically good that he is gone, I think there could be real strategic benefit ahead.
So I want to get to that with you. I want to talk about Israel's really astonishing strategic role that they have been on when you go back to this pager operation and all of these wins for them. But I want to go back for a moment to October the 7th, which we just passed the one-year anniversary of a little while ago. And I'm reminded of, I watched the raw video that the IDF had from that day, and it was such a brutal, horrific, I had never seen anything like that, never having been in war myself. So I remember one young man, and it came to mind as you talked about the way that Sinwar led his Hamas terrorists. And this young man I was on a cell phone of one of the people that he killed, and he called his parents and he said, "You'll be so proud of me. I've just killed 10 Jews.
Yeah.
I wish you had been here to see it."
Yeah. Yeah. The way to think about this is to answer the following question. Why did Sinwar kill 1,200 Jews on October 7th? The answer is because he couldn't kill 7 million. If he could have snapped his fingers and killed them all, he would have. If he had access to a nuclear weapon, he is suspect number one as to why Iran must never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. And thus, Sinwar's passing, if you will, the killing of Sinwar, I think goes down as one of the great wins in counterterrorism.
So, I've often thought about what his strategy was, and you just mentioned, his ability to kill 1,200 people. He took 250 people hostage, and we're going to learn more of the details, but it was thought that he was surrounding himself with some of these hostages in order to protect himself. There is some reporting that a tank went in and fired on his house. And then Netanyahu said something to the effect of, basically he ran like a coward, something along those lines. All these details we're going to learn. What do you think his goal was? Did he know that kind of barbaric attack would then see an enormous counterattack from Israel, during which we have seen a number of players around the world, start shaking their finger at Israel? Was that his goal, to be so horrific that he would produce this very enormous counterattack by Israel?
I think that's excellent analysis, absolutely true. Point one of his desire was to do everything he could to damage the status of Israel. And think how cowardly, how craven that is, to sacrifice Palestinians, those that he supposedly guarded and protected. He threw them into the fire of war in order to reduce the status of Israel. Point two, Martha, he wanted, in his twisted way, to get the issue of Palestinian statehood back into the international conversation. He was terrified that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel and it would foreclose the opportunity for a two-state solution. Those were his two goals. He ultimately will fail at both of them.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring that up, because we remember Bret Baier did an interview with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and he suggested that they were closer than ever at that moment. We saw the success of the Abraham Accords, and we did see this moment where Saudi Arabia saw the potential for Israel and the Saudis to become the benchmarks of the Middle East and push Iran aside.
Exactly. And let's put it this way. What the Trump administration did quite effectively was create the Abraham Accords. The next step would be an Abraham alliance, an actual security alliance between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. That was in the cards. Now it's been shattered, but regardless of who the next president is, both sides are going to want to pursue that and build on the Abraham Accords.
The Untold Story continues right after this.
Talk to me about the Biden administration. We just heard from Kamala Harris, the vice president, and, very much wants to be president. We're now about 19 days away from the U.S. election. And she came out and she basically said, the war must end now. And we heard from Netanyahu essentially professing that the goal has been reached. Sinwar is dead. A lot of the leadership is knocked out. The hostages have to come home and the war has to end. When we heard from Netanyahu, he said the hostages have to come home and the war is not over. At every juncture, the White House has told Israel, enough, use more restraint. And yet we've seen them succeeding in their goals here. What does that say to you about, the leadership from the White House on all of this?
It says that in war, fortune favors the bold. And I mean that both here in the Middle East, where Israel, as you said correctly, has unleashed a remarkable 2.5 months of unblemished success, not only against Hamas and Hezbollah, but against the Houthis and against Tehran. They have been bold, and we ought to encourage that. In Ukraine, similarly, we ought to be encouraging the Ukrainians to continue to strike and strike hard. And without question, in war, and I'll leave the domestic politics to others, but I know war well. And I will tell you that reach a moment in war where you've got to move forward. Israel is at one of those moments. They'll go at Hezbollah hard. I think they'll go at Tehran hard.
So now we have, this sort of back and forth with how how committed we want to be to Israel's military efforts. And I think the commitment to Israel and the future of Israel goes across party lines. But how to manage all of this does not necessarily. We've just given them, I don't know how many of these THAAD missile systems, anti-ballistic missile systems, and 100 U.S. service members to back them up and train them on it, I assume. What does that move say to you?
It says that we are going to continue our commitment to Israel. And by the way, that THAAD missile system, highly capable. It can knock down incoming ballistic missiles, critically important. Putting 100 U.S. troops there, I think, is a strong signal. I've had people say to me, oh, isn't that a real escalation? I don't think so. We already have several hundred U.S. troops in and around Israel assigned to the embassy, doing training in the West Bank, working with the Israelis. When I was the NATO commander, I went constantly to Israel. We have big exercises there with hundreds of U.S. troops. So adding 100 U.S. troops to bring in that THAAD missile system sends a strong signal to Israel, and it also, Martha, has real tactical benefit in defending Israel against ballistic missiles.
So at this moment, doesn't Iran essentially see the United States as at war with them on the side of Israel? Sending missiles, sending the THAAD system at war with them. And doesn't Russia see us at war with them in Ukraine, essentially?
In both cases, yes. And in both cases, we must not take counsel of our fears. We have to stand up to Iran, not just for Israel, but because of Iran's immense capacity for evil in the world, starting with current plots to try and assassinate presidential candidate Trump and a number of leaders from the Trump administration. That would be an act of war. I would say we are already in a significant conflict with Iran. And over on the other side of this, with Russia, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, their continuing occupation, the threat that they pose to NATO behind Ukraine. For all those reasons, we are, if not in a state of war, we're right aligned with that, and we must continue to prosecute both of those rogue states.
What do you say to those who say, we have spent billions of dollars, we have issues here at home, we have a border that is open, millions of people have poured across it, and they don't want to send their sons or daughters to fight either one of these wars?
I would say that's a legitimate conversation that I'd love to have with any individual, and I think we have the capacity and the will to do both. We can control our southern border. We have to. But controlling our southern border does not mean we have insufficient resources in order to support Israel, try and calm the Middle East, where a third of the world's oil comes from, and simultaneously support a regime in Ukraine that is standing on the front line against a rogue, dangerous, nuclear-armed international actor in Vladimir Putin. We can do all of those things. And by the way, in terms of sending sons and daughters forward, there are no sons and daughters in Ukraine. There are only a handful of Americans in Israel. So we are creating business term here, leverage. By spending a quite reasonable amount of money, we are pushing back against very dangerous regimes. And final thought, let's do the numbers for a minute here. Let's take Ukraine. U.S. defense budget is $900 billion, and we need it because we're in a big and dangerous world. The monies that we're sending to Ukraine for military assistance are $50 billion over 2 years, maybe $60 billion. And by the way, the Europeans have spent double that. So we're using leverage to stand against them, putting no U.S. troops at risk. I think it makes a lot of sense to do both of those. But I'm with you. I think our southern border is a significant national security threat. That ought to be job one, solving that. Again, we have the capacity to do all three.
So President Trump says often that we wouldn't be in these situations if he had been at the helm, if he had been in the White House, that Putin would not have, made a minor incursion that turned into a major incursion in Ukraine, and that Sinwar would not have pulled off October 7th if he were in charge. And I spoke recently with Boris Johnson, actually, the former Prime Minister of the UK, who said that, on the world stage, he always felt that the former president did present a strong, bullish front, that people didn't want to mess with him necessarily, and they didn't know exactly what he would do if they did, right? Do you agree with that?
I think it's impossible to know the answer to the question. If Donald Trump had been in his second term right now, conceivably, this might not have happened, but we'll never know the answer to that question. I think it is important, whoever is our next president, that he or she presents a strong front to the world, shows they're willing to prosecute these conflicts.
Has Joe Biden done that?
I think that the Biden administration has presented a strong front in Ukraine, for example. I think they presented a strong front in Israel. If you ask the Israelis, what more should we have gotten from a Biden administration? They don't have an answer to that. They've been given everything they need to prosecute these wars. And Ukraine has similarly received significant assistance from the United States. Now, if I had a criticism for the Biden administration, it would be too slow to need, too hesitant to send the top-end missile systems, the best tanks. We could have moved faster in Ukraine. But I think in terms of projecting a willingness to stand against these tyrannical regimes, I think they've been strong. And final thought, and here I would say Team Biden has done a very good job, is in alliances. They work together with NATO. They work with our Asian allies. They work with other states in ways that I think are very productive. We talked about the Abraham Accords recently. I'm enthusiastic about that. I wish that the Trump administration were as supportive of NATO as an organization as they have been in the Abraham Accords.
Well, they would say that they, pushed countries to do more financially, and that they succeeded in that, and they strengthened NATO as a result.
I think that is correct, but let's also recognize the NATO salesman of the year. It's Vladimir Putin. And when Russian tanks start rolling west, ding, 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 the light goes on for the Europeans. I think it's a combination. Mm-hmm. And Martha, I spent 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander. I yield to no one in my own importations to the Europeans to spend more on defense.
Let's talk for a few minutes about your book. You're a man of many talents, and the new book is called The Restless Wave, a novel of the United States Navy by Admiral James Stavridis. What was the motivation for this book? It's set at the early days of World War II and takes us through one young man's eyes through the battle in the Pacific, which is something that has been near to me in terms of learning as much as I can about it. So I'm really excited to read your book. What motivated this one?
Well, first, I want to compliment you on the writing you've done about the Pacific and your own personal connections to these very turbulent days. What drove me to write historical fiction about the early 40s is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said, the further into the future you want to look, the more you must understand the past. And I really believe there are fundamental lessons baked into those early days of World War II about great power war. What if we got into a war with U.S. and China? About the sweep of technology. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Same kind of technology changes happened at the start of World War II. And then finally, just as we see in the Middle East, we see the immense personal cost of all of this. The book, The Restless Wave, has a kind of wonderful, steamy love triangle between two young officers and a young woman. And I wrote that into it to show the personal side of this.
Is it based on any personal experience, Admiral?
Not of mine, but maybe of one of your family members. I don't know.
Yeah, I see so many parallels in the last minute we have. Is China behaving like Japan? Because Japan became very adventurous in their region and took over parts of China and the near islands and spaces around Japan in an aggressive way. Is that what's happening now?
I think it is, and this is precisely why I wanted to write the book at that level, to make the point that we need to wake up to the challenge that is headed toward us. And we've spent a lot of time, understandably, talking about the Middle East and Ukraine. Those are far less important than the Pacific, than China, and how all that comes out. And final thought, in the book, the little Easter egg, little clues as you go along, it's based on Dante's Inferno, which is what war really is.
Yeah. Three Rings of Hell.
Exactly.
Great. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you very much for being here. It's always good to see you, and congratulations on your new book, sir, and thank you for all of your service as the NATO Supreme Commander and all the years that led up to that. Thank you, sir. Good to be with
Martha.
you.
My pleasure.
That's the Untold Story for today. I'm Martha McCallum. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Make sure to rate and review. For more podcasts, go to foxnewspodcast.com. Listen ad-free with the Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.